August 1945. The Pacific air was still thick with smoke and silence. A small convoy of Allied trucks rumbled down a dirt road outside Manila, their engines echoing through the broken countryside. In the back, a group of Japanese women sat huddled together, nurses, clerks, and widows once stationed with the Imperial Army. Their faces were pale, eyes fixed on the horizon. They had been told that capture meant humiliation, or worse. Rumors had spread for years that Americans beheaded prisoners, that women were left to die in the mud. Every bump on the road felt like the last. As the trucks halted before a guarded compound surrounded by barbed wire, the women clutched one another's hands, whispering prayers through trembling lips. A command barked in English. Boots hit the dirt. They stepped down, expecting rifles to rise. Instead, a calm voice ordered them to line up for registration. One soldier handed out towels. Another pointed toward a long wooden building. The women hesitated, then realized steam was drifting through its windows. It wasn't smoke from a burning village. It was heat from showers. When Japan's surrender rippled across the Pacific in August 1945, it carried more than silence. It carried disbelief. For years, Japanese civilians had been fed the same unwavering message. Surrender meant dishonor. Capture meant death. In every town and garrison, the Imperial Code had warned that Allied soldiers were monsters, brutal, vengeful, and eager to erase Japan from the earth. Mothers whispered it to their sons before they went to war. Teachers drew it in chalk on classroom boards. And in the remote outposts of the Pacific, female auxiliaries serving as nurses, clerks, and medics clung to that fear as their final defense against despair. When word spread that Emperor Hirohito had spoken the unthinkable, that the war was lost, chaos followed. Units dissolved overnight. Orders vanished. Men burned documents. Women buried photographs and hid insignia beneath the soil. For the women who had followed the army into the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, the collapse meant being trapped between surrendering troops and advancing Allied columns. Many expected mass execution. Some attempted suicide. Others simply waited, paralyzed by exhaustion, until trucks appeared at dawn carrying soldiers in khaki and unfamiliar faces. In Manila, where the war's fury had left entire districts flattened, the first Allied detention centers were improvised within the ruins of old schools and hospitals. The Japanese women, captured in scattered groups, were processed alongside soldiers and civilian technicians. They braced for humiliation, interrogation, punishment, exposure to revenge. But what they encountered instead was a cold efficiency. Names were recorded, wounds examined, and identification tags attached. The men guarding them rarely spoke. Most of the Americans and Australians had already seen enough death to make cruelty meaningless. For the prisoners, the first shock was procedural calm. No beatings, no shouted insults, no gloating crowds. Some women wept in confusion. Others looked for hidden traps. An interpreter explained that they were now prisoners of war protected by the Geneva Convention. Few understood what that meant. To most of them, the Geneva Convention was a Western abstraction, a foreign ideal that couldn't possibly apply to an enemy that had bombed Pearl Harbor or razed Nanking. Yet here it was, written on paper, shaping the way their captors behaved. The Allied command had learned from years of grim experience that the treatment of prisoners echoed across the world. Reports of abuse could provoke retaliation against Allied POWs still held in Asia. By 1945, thousands of American, British, and Australian soldiers were still languishing in Japanese camps, starved and beaten. For their sake, orders were clear. The Allies would not answer cruelty with cruelty. They would prove by conduct what propaganda had denied, that surrender did not always end in horror. The transition from terror to confusion unfolded slowly. The women were stripped of weapons and valuables, then given basic supplies, soap, a blanket, and astonishingly, sanitary items. For many, this small act carried more emotional weight than the surrender itself. It suggested that their captors saw them not as enemies, but as human beings. Still, fear lingered in every movement. They slept in rows on wooden floors, their ears tuned to every footstep outside. Each morning, a whistle signaled roll call. The guards counted quietly, no whips cracked. Outside the camp's wire, Manila was rebuilding under the blinding tropical sun. U.S. Army engineers cleared debris. Trucks hauled water and rations. Among the Allied staff were nurses from the U.S. Army Medical Corps who volunteered to assist with civilian and POW care. They brought rations of condensed milk and vitamins, their khaki uniforms stained from weeks of labor. The Japanese women watched in silence as these same uniforms approached them, the very image of an enemy they had been taught to hate. Gradually, routines replaced panic. There were medical inspections, vaccination lines, and even lectures about hygiene. The camp's mess hall served simple rice and vegetables. One prisoner, a former nurse from Yokohama, later recalled that she trembled the first time she saw American cooks boiling water for tea, fearing it might be poisoned. Yet within days, hunger overcame suspicion. She drank, and nothing happened, except warmth spreading through an empty stomach. Each passing day revealed another small contradiction to years of indoctrination. The soldiers did not leer, the nurses did not mock, even the guards avoided unnecessary contact. The greatest cruelty was indifference, the quiet bureaucratic rhythm of a system designed to process prisoners, not destroy them. Still, in the minds of the women, every kindness felt like a deception waiting to collapse. By late September, the camp received orders from higher command. All Japanese nationals, regardless of gender, were to be registered and classified for repatriation under international supervision. The war that had taught them to die with honor was now forcing them to live with uncertainty. And as the humid night stretched on beneath a canopy of strange foreign stars, one question repeated in every whispered conversation: why are they treating us this way? The women's internment camps that dotted the Philippines, Borneo, and the Dutch East Indies were quiet paradoxes in the wreckage of a war built on hate. Inside the fences, life was neither free nor brutal, suspended somewhere between guilt and mercy. The Japanese women, many of them nurses or clerks who had once tended wounded soldiers under the rising sun flag, now spent their days cleaning barracks, boiling rice, and staring through the wire at a world they no longer understood. The Allied officers overseeing these camps operated under strict protocols. Each camp was inspected regularly by medical officers, Red Cross representatives, and interpreters trained to record conditions for international monitoring. These reports were not meant for propaganda. They were official, written in neutral language and filed to Washington, London, and Melbourne. They described weight loss, medical needs, morale, and the progress of cultural adjustment. Among those dry lines lay something rare in wartime paperwork: evidence of restraint. For the Allied soldiers who guarded them, this restraint was not born from sympathy. It was duty. The men who stood watch over Japanese prisoners had seen the aftermath of Bataan, the Death March, and the skeletal survivors liberated from Japanese camps. Every instinct inside them burned with memory and anger. Yet their commanders drilled the same rule over and over: discipline is our revenge. The best answer to barbarity was civilization itself. The Japanese women didn't know this. They saw the guards' silence and mistook it for contempt or cold preparation for something worse. It took time for disbelief to fade. In the first weeks, prisoners flinched at sudden noises. They lined up in perfect military posture, expecting punishment for hesitation. Some refused to bathe, fearing the showers were traps. The guards, realizing their fear, sometimes demonstrated by using the facilities first, stepping under the running water and laughing awkwardly to show that it was safe. For the women who had imagined beheading, the sound of warm water hitting concrete was almost unbearable. It was too kind, too human. Medical records show that many of these women were malnourished, suffering from malaria, dysentery, and severe dehydration when captured. Allied doctors treated them with the same supplies used for their own troops: quinine, sulfa powder, penicillin, resources Japan had lost long ago. To the prisoners, the smell of antiseptic and soap carried an almost sacred confusion. They were being cared for by men they had been told were demons. Some of the American nurses who worked in the camps later wrote brief accounts in military newsletters. One described a Japanese nurse who broke down crying while being given a new uniform. She thought it was for execution, the nurse recalled. She cried harder when we told her it was for her health inspection. Such scenes repeated across several detention centers. Every act of care seemed to cut deeper than cruelty ever could. It forced the prisoners to confront something they could not explain: mercy from the enemy. Meanwhile, outside the wire, Allied propaganda teams were collecting testimonies from liberated civilians and POWs, stories of torture, forced labor, and executions. Yet even as these reports horrified the world, the Allied command insisted on maintaining ethical treatment for captured Japanese. The logic was strategic and moral. They wanted to show the world that democracy, even when victorious, did not mirror its enemy's brutality. Every hot shower, every meal, every medical inspection inside those camps became a quiet declaration of that principle. For the Japanese women, time blurred inside the camps. They measured days by the rattle of meal tins and the whistle that marked curfew. Slowly, the rhythm of terror faded. They began to speak among themselves again, to trade stories about home, about Hokkaido winters, Osaka markets, and family photographs hidden in their clothes. Some even volunteered to help Allied nurses with cleaning and hospital duties, instinctively returning to the roles they once held. Their work was simple, but it gave them purpose, and in that purpose, they rediscovered something dangerously close to dignity. By November, preparations began for repatriation. Ships were being arranged to take prisoners back to Japan under the supervision of Allied maritime patrols. The women watched the horizon through the barbed wire, unsure what waited for them. Japan was no longer the Japan they had left. Cities burned, families scattered, the emperor's voice now a quiet echo of surrender. The war had ended, but the shame had not. In those final weeks before departure, an Allied officer addressed the group through an interpreter. His words were plain, almost bureaucratic. "You will go home. The war is over. No one will harm you here." Some women bowed automatically. Others stood frozen, still unable to believe that war could end with kindness. Yet as the trucks arrived to take them toward the docks, their fear no longer ruled them. It had turned into something softer, bewilderment mixed with reluctant gratitude. The journey that began in terror was ending in silence. And within that silence, the old lies of empire were beginning to crumble. In the long shadow of Japan's surrender, the story of these women became a quiet study in contrast between what they had been told to expect and what they actually found. The first angle is cultural and psychological, rooted in the powerful machinery of wartime propaganda that shaped every thought they carried into captivity. For nearly a decade, Japanese citizens had been told that the Allied powers, particularly Americans, were savage, godless invaders. School children were made to recite slogans about dying for the emperor. Posters showed grotesque caricatures of Western soldiers stabbing infants, trampling temples, and mocking Japanese honor. Radio broadcasts repeated the same refrain: "Better to die than fall into enemy hands." For women, the warning was even sharper. Capture meant shame worse than death. It was drilled into them with religious intensity. When these women were finally taken prisoner, every part of their identity had been conditioned for fear. They weren't just surrendering as soldiers. They were surrendering as daughters of a nation that had equated mercy with weakness. This psychological tension became clear in the first days of captivity. Allied guards noticed that the Japanese women refused to make eye contact. They moved in silence, heads bowed, waiting for the inevitable blow that never came. Some tried to maintain military decorum, addressing each other by rank, refusing to speak in the presence of men. Others wept quietly through the night, unable to understand why their captors had not yet executed them. It was as if the very existence of kindness had become impossible to process. The second angle is human, the gradual erosion of fear through simple acts of decency. One nurse in her 20s, later identified in Red Cross reports as Kei Fujimoto, had spent the war in a field hospital near Bataan. When captured, she was skeletal, suffering from malaria and infection. Allied doctors treated her with penicillin, a medicine she had never seen before. In her first written testimony months later, she described how the injection burned her arm, but also how it marked the first time I realized I was not going to die. The medicine did more than save her body. It rewired her understanding of the enemy. Dozens of similar cases appeared across the camps. Prisoners were issued clean bedding, medical care, and regular meals, all according to Allied policy. But for the women who had lived through bombings and starvation, this basic treatment felt surreal. One American nurse noted that many of the Japanese women initially refused soap or refused to eat, fearing the items were tricks. It took days for trust to form, and when it did, it was fragile, like glass handled too tightly. The third angle lies in the moral paradox that haunted everyone inside those barbed fences. The Allied soldiers and medics who cared for these prisoners were not blind to what Japan had done. Many had lost comrades in brutal camps across the Pacific. Some had marched through the ashes of Manila and seen civilians burned alive. To them, compassion felt like betrayal. Yet when faced with frail, starving women who could barely lift their heads, the lines between vengeance and humanity blurred. The war demanded hatred, but conscience demanded restraint. In that conflict between duty and rage, the true victory was not military. It was moral. Allied commanders understood this. Official memoranda from the Philippines campaign instructed all units handling Japanese prisoners to maintain strict adherence to international codes and humanitarian standards. The orders were not sentimental, they were strategic, designed to demonstrate to the world that civilization had triumphed over barbarism. Every Japanese prisoner who went home with a story of fair treatment became a silent messenger that democracy did not mirror cruelty. The fourth angle reveals a deeper irony. While Japanese propaganda had painted the West as immoral, the reality unfolding inside the camps was a reversal. The captors, not the captives, embodied discipline and order. Even simple gestures, a soldier helping a sick prisoner to her feet, a nurse offering water, carried enormous symbolic weight. They were tiny moral victories written into the record of war's aftermath. The final human dimension was transformation. Among the prisoners, a slow emotional shift began to take place. Once the terror subsided, curiosity replaced it. Some of the younger women began to ask questions through interpreters about the strange canned food, about the music the soldiers played from their radios at night, about the uniforms stitched with names. One asked why Americans smiled when speaking to strangers, why they laughed so easily after so much killing. These exchanges, small and awkward, became the first fragile bridges between two worlds that had been taught to despise each other. In the stillness of those camps, compassion became a weapon more powerful than any rifle. It dismantled years of indoctrination not through speeches or force, but through quiet, repeated proof that mercy could exist even between enemies. Each act of humanity chipped away at a myth that had ruled Japan's empire for generations, the myth that honor required hatred. By late 1945, when news reached the camps that Japan's Home Ministry had begun preparing for the return of its citizens, many of the women no longer spoke of execution. They spoke instead of homecomings, of families they feared to face, of the shame they carried for surviving. The same kindness that had saved their lives now forced them to confront a harder truth. Survival itself had become a form of guilt. Their journey through captivity was no longer about the war. It was about learning how to exist in a world where enemies had shown them more mercy than their own leaders ever had. There was another side to this strange moment of history. The perspective of the captors themselves. The Allied soldiers who guarded the camps were not saints. Many carried scars that would never heal, both physical and unseen. They had fought through jungles, lost friends in the mud, seen the bodies of tortured POWs. To them, Japan's surrender was not a clean victory. It was the end of something unspeakably cruel, and now they were face to face with the people they had been told were responsible. But instead of vengeance, orders demanded restraint. That tension lived inside every soldier who stood at those gates. For some, the discipline was unbearable. For others, it became a quiet redemption. They had seen what hatred did. They had walked through the ruins of Nanking, through the ash of Manila, through the camps where Allied soldiers had wasted away behind bamboo fences. Yet they had also seen how hatred consumed everything, including the victors. To treat these Japanese women humanely was not weakness. It was a declaration that civilization had survived the war. The guards' daily lives were a study in control, at distance. They spoke little, kept their tone formal, and avoided any hint of familiarity. When they offered food or medicine, they did so without comment. The Japanese prisoners, conditioned to interpret every gesture as a test, often bowed too deeply or froze mid-step. Both sides moved carefully, as though language itself could detonate. Yet, within this tension, a strange mutual respect began to grow. Not born of sympathy, but of exhaustion. Each side had seen too much death to want any more of it. Among the most remarkable observers of this quiet coexistence were the Red Cross delegates who visited the camps in late 1945. Their reports, now preserved in archives, describe scenes that contrasted sharply with the wartime imagery of brutality. They wrote of Japanese women knitting together, singing softly in their native tongue, and even exchanging polite greetings with Allied nurses. The tone of these reports was factual, but between the lines ran an unmistakable subtext. Humanity had somehow endured. Still, not all guards found peace in duty. Some wrestled with bitterness every time they saw a Japanese uniform. One Australian corporal later wrote in his diary that he forced himself to remember his brother, who had died on the Burma Railway, yet chose not to take revenge. "If I become like them," he wrote, "then we lost, even if we won." His words captured the essence of post-war morality, the understanding that victory meant nothing if it came at the cost of conscience. The next angle belongs to history itself, the broader framework that made such treatment possible. By 1945, Allied command structures had institutionalized the Geneva Convention into every level of military law. Manuals instructed officers on the ethical handling of POWs, emphasizing documentation, health records, and accountability. Commanders knew that how they treated their enemies would define how the world judged them after the war. In a sense, every clean bed, every meal served, and every shower provided to Japanese captives was part of a moral performance before the eyes of history. But beneath that calculated discipline lay a genuine transformation. The war had forced modern democracies to prove that their values were more than slogans, that even in victory, they could uphold humanity. For the Japanese women, this moral struggle played out in gestures they could not yet name. They saw Allied soldiers eat side by side with Filipino laborers, something unthinkable in the rigid hierarchies of Japan's empire. They heard laughter among men of different ranks and races. In time, they began to realize that this equality, this small decency, was what Japan had been fighting against without ever understanding why. That realization would haunt many of them long after the war. The final angle of this story belongs to the invisible space between memory and silence, what the women chose to forget and what they could not. When repatriation finally began, they boarded ships under guarded escort, carrying meager belongings, a blanket, a small tin cup, a pair of Allied-issued shoes. On the voyage home, most spoke little. The sea stretched endlessly around them, erasing boundaries between past and present. Some cried quietly, others stared at the horizon, wondering how they would explain what had happened. That the enemy they were told would kill them had instead shown mercy. When the ships reached Japan, they stepped onto shattered docks surrounded by ruins. The air smelled of ash and salt. Reporters and officials recorded their names, but not their stories. Their accounts of kindness didn't fit the narrative of noble sacrifice or righteous defeat. Japan, still reeling from surrender, had no space for tales of compassion from the other side. So the women said little. They folded their experiences into silence, burying them beneath the noise of reconstruction and shame. Decades later, fragments of their testimonies emerged in interviews, letters, and Red Cross archives. A few survivors described their confusion, their gratitude, their quiet guilt. One wrote, "They treated us like humans when we did not believe we still were." Another said, "I went to war believing death was honor. I came home believing mercy was stronger." Those sentences, brief and fragile, reveal the enduring truth of their captivity. The experience had not erased the horrors of the war, nor absolved the crimes committed in its name. But it had revealed something unexpected within its wreckage, the ability of ordinary people to resist hatred when everything around them demanded it. In the end, the story of these Japanese women was not just about survival. It was about transformation, the slow unlearning of fear, the rediscovery of humanity, and the proof that even in a world broken by violence, compassion could still command obedience. And for the men who guarded them, that same realization echoed in quiet moments long after the war. When they closed their eyes years later, they didn't see enemies behind barbed wire. They saw faces, tired, frightened, human, and the faint, rising steam of a shower in the ruins of Manila. The transformation began with something as ordinary as steam. Inside the repurposed schoolhouse that served as a camp building, pipes groaned and hot water poured from steel showerheads scavenged from abandoned U.S. bases. The Japanese women had entered trembling, clutching their clothes as if they were shields. For years they had been told that Allied soldiers mutilated prisoners, that women were stripped for ridicule, that death was preferable to surrender. Now they stood under falling water, watching grime slide from their skin and vanish into the drains. For the first time since capture, they felt heat that did not come from fire or bombs. No one spoke at first. Then someone began to cry. It wasn't a loud sob, just a quiet release, a sound that spread through the tiled room like smoke. The guards outside heard it and looked away. They understood. Some of them had wept the same way in their own moments of survival. The camp routine soon followed a pattern: morning roll call, medical checks, simple meals of rice, soup, and tea. The prisoners learned to bow less deeply, to look their guards in the eye, to respond to names instead of numbers. Each small act felt like walking barefoot across unknown ground. For the Allied nurses assigned to assist them, the task was more complicated than medicine. They were dealing with patients who did not trust comfort. When given soap, the women held it as though it might dissolve into poison. When offered new uniforms, they folded them neatly but refused to wear them until commanded. It took gentle insistence, patience, and sometimes humor to pierce the wall of fear. A U.S. Army nurse named Helen Andrews later wrote in her diary that one morning, while tending to a group of Japanese women, she heard laughter, soft, hesitant, and genuine. It startled her more than any battle noise she had known. "I didn't think I'd ever hear that sound again," she wrote. "Not from them, not from me." That laughter marked the quiet heart of the story, the exact moment when disbelief turned to fragile trust. The showers, the clean sheets, the steaming cups of soup were not luxuries, they were proof. Proof that compassion could survive in a place built for war. Outside the camp, Manila's ruins told a different story. Bombed-out churches, skeletons of streetcars, hollow-eyed civilians wandering through rubble. The cost of Japan's occupation lay everywhere. The guards who walked those streets before returning to camp carried that contrast with them. They had seen the destruction, they had buried children in the wreckage. Yet when they passed through the camp gates, they treated their captives with the same professionalism. They could not erase what had happened, but they could choose not to repeat it. Among the prisoners, one woman named Aki, a nurse who had served on Luzon, became a quiet leader. She was older, with a face worn by exhaustion but steady eyes. The younger women looked to her for guidance. She translated orders, comforted the sick, and reminded them to hold dignity even in shame. When a fever outbreak swept the barracks, Aki worked alongside the American nurses, boiling water, cleaning wounds, and administering quinine. She did not ask permission. She simply worked. The guards allowed it. By then, the invisible line between captor and captive had blurred. They were all survivors of the same storm. When word spread that Allied command would begin processing female prisoners for return to Japan, emotions twisted again. Some women rejoiced. Others feared what awaited them at home: disgrace, rejection, perhaps even accusations of collaboration. The idea of going home alive, once a dream, now felt uncertain. "We had lived under their care," one later wrote. "Now we would face our own people again, and I did not know which frightened me more." One evening, just before sunset, the women were called to an assembly. An American officer read out names and instructions through an interpreter. At the end, he hesitated, then spoke a few words directly to them. "The war is over. You will go home." He paused, searching for something beyond orders. "You have been brave." It was a small statement, but it landed like thunder. The women bowed, many weeping openly. Some tried to speak, but couldn't find the words in either language. In that moment, the barbed wire seemed to lose its meaning. The guards were no longer enemies. The prisoners were no longer faceless. They were all participants in the uneasy aftermath of mercy. That night, the camp grew strangely quiet. The guards smoked outside, watching the fireflies blink across the humid air. Inside the barracks, the women lay awake, listening to the soft hum of generators and the distant sound of waves against the shore. For the first time since the war began, no one feared dawn. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that war had tried to erase, the possibility that humanity could return, one small act at a time. The morning of departure arrived beneath a pale, washed-out sky. Trucks lined the dirt road outside the compound, engines idling in a low, steady growl. The Japanese women stood in quiet formation, clutching small bundles of belongings: a blanket, a cup, a few letters, and the plain khaki uniforms they had worn for weeks. The smell of diesel mixed with the scent of soap still clinging to their skin. It was the smell of survival. The Allied guards moved methodically, calling names, checking lists, confirming identification. Each prisoner stepped forward, saluted stiffly out of habit, and climbed onto the trucks. No chains, no shouts, no blindfolds, just procedure, precise, unhurried, human. For some, that very calm was unbearable. One woman trembled as she boarded, whispering to her companion that the kindness could not last. She believed the trucks were driving them to execution grounds. Decades of conditioning would not vanish in a single morning. As the convoy rolled out, the women saw what remained of the Philippines. Manila was a skeleton city, walls charred, streets flooded with debris, silent churches standing amid open graves. It was there, in those ruins, that they realized how much the world had changed while they were hiding behind illusions of glory. The empire they had served had fallen not just in defeat, but in belief. Everything they had been taught about enemies and honor lay broken in the rubble. At the docks, the sea waited, gray and vast under the rising sun. Allied officers, Filipino dock workers, and Red Cross representatives moved through the crowd, guiding groups toward transport ships. The women stepped down from the trucks, eyes darting across the unfamiliar scene. Americans in pressed uniforms, Filipinos unloading supplies, nurses distributing rations. A Red Cross official handed each woman a medical tag and a small packet containing soap, bandages, and biscuits. Some of them bowed instinctively, unsure whether to thank their captors or stay silent. Then came the final inspection. A U.S. naval doctor, flanked by interpreters, examined each woman for signs of illness. When one prisoner fainted from exhaustion, he caught her before she hit the ground. The simple reflex, catching rather than letting her fall, rippled through the line like a shockwave. A few women began to cry quietly, not from fear, but from something even more disorienting: relief. Nearby, an American nurse, the same Helen Andrews who had once written about hearing laughter, watched the scene unfold and felt the same ache of contradiction. She knew what her countrymen had endured in Japanese camps. She had treated survivors too frail to stand, men who had been whipped and starved, yet here she was, helping the very people whose flag had flown over those atrocities. It made no sense, and yet it felt necessary. "We had to prove that mercy was stronger than rage," she wrote later. "Otherwise, everything we fought for was a lie." As the women boarded the ship, the atmosphere turned hushed. They moved slowly, bowing again and again toward the guards who had once frightened them. The gestures were not ceremonial. They were instinctive expressions of something they could not yet articulate, a gratitude deeper than language. One woman pressed her palms together in silent prayer before stepping onto the gangway. Another turned back for one last look at the camp beyond the harbor, the fences, the watchtowers, the huts. For months it had been her prison. Now it was the place where she had rediscovered her humanity. The ship's horn sounded, long and mournful. The waves churned as the vessel pulled away from the dock. On deck, the women gathered along the railing, watching the shore recede. None spoke. They simply stood in rows, hair whipping in the sea wind, the morning light reflecting off their eyes. Behind them, the Allied guards saluted. A small gesture of respect, rarely recorded in war reports, but remembered by those who saw it. For hours, the ship sailed through the open water. The women remained silent, each alone with her thoughts. Some prayed. Others stared at the horizon, the line between sky and sea blurring like a memory already fading. One, perhaps the nurse Aki, reached into her pocket and unfolded a small scrap of paper she had been allowed to keep, a list of patients she had treated before, capture, names now likely lost to time. She held it tightly, as if holding the last proof that she had once belonged somewhere. As night fell, the deck lights glowed dimly against the dark sea. The women lay down on thin mattresses, the hum of the engines beneath them. The ship's doctor made quiet rounds, checking pulses, covering blankets. In one corner, a young woman whispered to her companion that she had dreamt of her mother's voice calling her home. Her friend smiled weakly and said nothing. The sea answered with its endless rhythm, not of war drums, but of peace returning, wave after wave. When morning came again, they saw the faint outline of Japan rising from the mist. Mountains, shorelines, smoke from small fishing boats. They had come home to a nation in ruins, a land both familiar and foreign. Yet even as tears welled in their eyes, they carried something invisible back with them, a lesson born not from victory or defeat, but from the unexpected grace of survival. The war had taught them to expect cruelty. What they found instead was proof that mercy, even in the hands of an enemy, could remake the meaning of humanity itself. When the ships reached Japan, the harbors were ghostly. The docks were splintered, cranes twisted, and the air hung thick with coal dust and resignation. The women stepped off in silence, greeted not by celebration, but by officials with clipboards and hollow expressions. Japan was no longer the empire they had left. It was a broken country learning how to breathe again. Medical teams examined them, recording weights and illnesses. Many of the returning POWs weighed less than 90 pounds. They were sent to temporary recovery centers established by the Allied occupation forces. A strange reversal of fate, where the same enemy who had once imprisoned them now supervised their rehabilitation. The irony was inescapable. American nurses administered vitamins and vaccinations. Japanese interpreters relayed instructions in their own language. It was a mirror image of the camps they had left behind, only this time the roles of conqueror and conquered were inverted. But for the women, the true battle began not with hunger or sickness, but with shame. Japan's military culture had never learned how to process defeat, and for women, captivity carried a special stigma. Many feared being labeled as collaborators or disgraced soldiers. Families had been told that capture was dishonor beyond forgiveness. Some of the women lied about their experiences, saying they had worked in hospitals rather than internment camps. Others retreated into silence, unable to reconcile kindness from an enemy with the propaganda they had once believed. Yet a few dared to speak the truth. In private gatherings and in quiet interviews with occupation officials, they described the hot showers, the clean sheets, the doctors who had treated them without contempt. Their words often met with disbelief. How could the barbarians they had been taught to fear show compassion when Japan's own army had shown none? The contradiction was too heavy for a nation still grieving. Most of their testimonies were buried in archives, untranslated, ignored, but they existed. Small, fragile pieces of evidence that war had not completely erased decency. Among the records was one striking letter written by a Japanese nurse who had served in the Philippines. She described how she had been captured expecting death, but instead found kindness. "They gave us soap and tea," she wrote. "I thought it was poison. But when I lived, I realized the poison had been in our hearts, not theirs." The letter never reached publication, but it survived in the files of the Allied Translation and Interrogation Service, a single sheet of paper that spoke louder than any speech about surrender. Life in post-war Japan moved quickly. The women who had returned from captivity faded into ordinary existence, working in hospitals, teaching, raising families. Their children grew up hearing little of the war. The mothers avoided the subject, not from fear, but from weariness. The memory of mercy did not erase the trauma of defeat. It simply became another scar, one that did not ache until silence settled at night. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Allied personnel who had overseen the camps also carried their memories. Some wrote memoirs, others never spoke of it again. For many, the experience of caring for Japanese prisoners became the moment when they understood the true cost of war. Compassion had demanded more strength than combat ever did. It required them to suppress rage, to act with civility in the face of ghosts. They didn't see their actions as heroic, they saw them as necessary, proof that humanity could survive its own darkness. By 1947, nearly all surviving Japanese POWs had been repatriated. The world moved on to new conflicts, new fears, and new frontiers. Yet in the quiet margins of post-war life, those few women who had expected beheading but found mercy carried within them a story the world rarely told. And sometimes the greatest victory of all is restraint. In the years that followed, the story of the Japanese women POWs faded quietly into history, eclipsed by louder tales of war crimes, tribunals, and reconstruction. Japan's collective memory preferred narratives of sacrifice, the soldiers who fought to the death, the civilians who endured the bombings, not those who surrendered and survived. The women who had lived through mercy were out of place in a nation still trying to define honor through suffering. Many of them never spoke publicly about their imprisonment. They returned to the rhythm of daily life, blending into the shadows of rebuilding cities. Some married former soldiers, others became nurses again in hospitals now funded by American aid. Yet inside, they carried memories that defied the logic of both sides. At night, they remembered the sound of the showers hissing in that Manila camp, the smell of soap and steam, the gentle voice of a nurse handing them tea. It wasn't gratitude they felt. It was something deeper and harder to name, an understanding that compassion could live even in war's ruins. A handful of Allied veterans later sought to find the people they had guarded. Letters were exchanged through Red Cross intermediaries, brief, restrained messages of remembrance. One American medic wrote simply, "I hope you found peace." A Japanese nurse replied, "You gave me back my life when I believed it was over." Their words never reached newspapers or history books, but they bridged a distance no treaty ever could. Historians who later uncovered these documents were struck by the restraint of it all. No declarations of forgiveness, no dramatic reunions, only quiet acknowledgments. The war had taken too much for grand gestures. What remained were fragments, a diary entry, a medical report, a faded photograph of Japanese women smiling faintly aboard a repatriation ship. In one of the last surviving Red Cross reports from 1946, an Allied inspector summarized his observations with chilling simplicity. Treatment humane, spirits low, discipline maintained, some laughter heard. That final line, "some laughter heard," carried more weight than the rest of the report combined. It was proof that amid the ashes of hatred, humanity had made a sound again. The legacy of those camps lingered quietly in the moral imagination of the post-war world. For the Allies, they became a silent example of how restraint had shaped victory. For Japan, they stood as an unspoken reminder that mercy, once dismissed as weakness, had preserved what the empire's fury had destroyed: dignity. And for the women themselves, the memory lived not as a tale of rescue, but as a transformation they could never fully explain. One of them, interviewed in her old age, said, "When I saw the showers, I thought it was death, but it was life. I stepped in with fear and came out human again." She died a year later, her story almost unknown beyond a few paragraphs in an academic journal. Yet her words encapsulated everything the war could not destroy: the fragile, defiant survival of empathy. By the 1970s, when Japan had risen again as an industrial power and the war receded into textbooks, the women's story had become little more than a footnote. But for those who still remember, Allied medics, Filipino civilians, Red Cross delegates, it remained something sacred. In a time when cruelty had been normalized, these brief acts of compassion had become small revolutions. History often remembers who won and who lost, but buried in its quieter corners are those who simply refused to become monsters, who chose decency over vengeance, who washed the blood from their hands not with pride, but with water and mercy. For the Japanese women who expected beheading and found instead the warmth of showers and clean sheets, the war ended not in death, but in revelation. They discovered that humanity was not the property of nations or armies. It was a choice. And even in 1945, when the world was at its darkest, someone still chose it. In every war, there are moments that defy the logic of violence, moments when the machinery of destruction pauses long enough for something purely human to appear. The story of the Japanese women prisoners belongs to that rare space between brutality and grace. It is not about victory or defeat, nor about guilt or innocence. It is about what happens when mercy is shown in a world that has forgotten what mercy means. The women who stepped off those trucks in 1945 believed they were walking toward execution. Every sound, every uniform, every foreign voice seemed to confirm the nightmare they had been raised to expect. Yet what awaited them was not death, but dignity. A towel, a shower, a bed, a meal. It was such an ordinary kindness that it felt miraculous. The enemy they feared most treated them not as trophies of war, but as human beings. And in that reversal, something within them broke, not from pain, but from understanding. The Allied soldiers, too, carried their own invisible burdens. Many had fought through horror and loss. Their choice to show restraint, to act with decency instead of vengeance, became one of the quietest yet most powerful victories of the entire war. They proved that civilization could endure even after the world had gone mad. What happened in those camps did not erase the atrocities committed elsewhere. It did not rewrite history, but it offered a glimpse of what history could have been. A vision of humanity that refused to disappear completely, even in the ashes. Years later, when those women grew old, few spoke of their captivity. But those who did remembered not the wire or the guards, but the warmth of water on their skin, the strange peace of being allowed to live. They remembered how mercy, once received, could never be forgotten. Their story reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of war, there are still choices. And sometimes, the smallest acts of compassion can echo louder than victory parades. Because history, when stripped of flags and hatred, is not about who conquered whom. It's about who, in the end, remained human